Not all pain screams. Some turn into silence, others into overwhelming strength. Some people have learned to look fine just so they don't worry anyone. But behind the control, the coldness, the extreme independence, there's a story. I warned you. When pain isn't understood, it hides and becomes behavior. And you know what's worse? Almost no one sees it. They just judge. In our time together now, you are going to understand the 13 hidden traits of those who've suffered too much and why these people behave so differently, often even from themselves. And most importantly, how to turn this silent pain into awareness, into choice, into healing. Stay with me until the end, for this might change the way you see yourself and the way you see the people you hold dear. Some scars don't show on the body, but they are there, in the way someone looks, in how long it takes to trust, in the urge to disappear sometimes, even when surrounded by people. Some wounds leave no visible marks, but shape everything inside. Quietly, they change the way someone exists. Old pain does not announce itself. It becomes a way of being. It becomes silence where there should be words. It becomes stiffness where once there was openness. Sometimes the person even forgets they are carrying something. They just know they are tired, that everything takes more effort than it should, that life for some reason always feels heavier. I have said that trauma is a psychic wound that when ignored keeps bleeding inside. But I also said that this wound can become a passage not to forget what hurt, but to transform what still pulses like a threat. When pain is truly heard, it doesn't become a sentence. It becomes awareness. The problem is, almost no one teaches us how to listen to pain. The world demands performance, not listening. And so, those who've suffered too much learn to cope. They build masks, create emotional shortcuts, hide. They go on living, sometimes even smiling. But something inside stays on, high alert, as if any touch could reopen what barely managed to heal. You might recognize yourself in many of these traits, or you might think of someone you love who suddenly makes more sense now. Either way, what matters here isn't to analyze anyone. It is to embrace with more empathy, with more presence, and most of all, with less guilt, because every behavior has a story behind it. No trait shows up out of nowhere. So, if at any point during this discourse you feel a lump in your throat or the need to take a deeper breath, do not be surprised. It is just your soul recognizing a piece of itself. And that, as simple as it may seem, is already a huge step. Some people learned early on that depending is dangerous, that asking hurts, that counting on someone can lead to humiliation or abandonment. And so, as a response, the psyche builds a solution. The person becomes everything for themselves, strong, decisive, unbreakable, but inside, exhausted. I spoke of the false self as a structure the ego builds to survive when being who you are becomes too risky. It is a way of functioning that does protect but also isolates. The person gets used to carrying everything alone, and the world, without realizing it, starts believing they actually can handle it all. But no one should have to handle everything all the time. That's why the first trait of those who've suffered too much in life is the armor of hyper-independence. It is not a sign of maturity. It is an old scar. It may look impressive from afar, but inside it is heavy as lead. The person refuses to show pain, but feels it. Refuses to ask for comfort, but needs it. They just don't know how anymore. Or they are ashamed or do not even remember what it is like to trust without fear. This rigidity spreads into relationships, friendships, work. Everything becomes performance. Everything becomes self-control. But there is a cost. The chest gets tighter. Touch becomes a threat. Rest, a weakness. And even surrounded by people, the person feels alone inside. Because hyper-independence isn't freedom. It is a prison with an internal lock. Those who live with it do not want to be a burden. They just want to make sure they will never be left hanging again. But deep down, it is just another way to stay silently wounded. The second trait, often seen in people who've suffered too much, is excessive empathy. At first glance, it seems like a virtue, and in many cases it is. But when empathy becomes a survival mechanism, it stops being just a quality and turns into a coping strategy. Some people, even as children, learned to scan the room like they were looking for shelter. They could feel in the air when something was about to go wrong. They picked up on the tone of voice, on a glance, on silence. They developed such sharp sensitivity that without realizing it, they started feeling for others before they even knew how to name what they felt for themselves. This over-empathy does not come from a light place. It is born out of necessity, from the fear of being the target of an unstable father, from the effort to anticipate the next emotional outburst from a mother, from the burden of keeping peace at home, even if peace costs their own childhood. I call projection this unconscious move of placing onto others something we haven't yet dared to see in ourselves. And often that is what happens with those who feel too much for others. They are unknowingly trying to care for in others a pain they haven't faced in themselves. The person becomes the constant support, the go-to advisor, the one who is always there. But behind all that giving lies a deep exhaustion, because those who feel for everyone all the time almost always forget about themselves. Too much empathy may seem noble, and sometimes it is, but it can also be a form of escape, a way to avoid diving into one's own pain, a way to exist for others, because existing for oneself became too heavy. Worse, this kind of empathy can lead to unbalanced relationships, ones where one gives and the other only takes, where listening to the other becomes an excuse to never hear yourself. And little by little, that sensitivity turns into overload. People who carry this trait often feel invisible when they are not being useful. And that is the clearest sign that empathy in this case stopped being love and became a defense mechanism. Deep down, all this emotional sensitivity has a reason. Someone back then had to anticipate emotions to survive, but now they do not have to anymore. And maybe the greatest act of real empathy is finally turning that attentiveness inward. Some people love halfway, not because they do not feel they feel way too much, but they hold back. They observe, they analyze every detail before opening their heart. And even when they start to trust, they always keep a part of themselves hidden away, a part no one touches, a part that always doubts. It is like something inside constantly whispers, careful, this could hurt again. And it really could. For someone who was broken right where they most needed safety, opening up stopped being simple. The memory of abandonment screams louder than the presence of affection. Love shows up, but fear tags along. This is the third trait of those who've suffered too much: fear of true relationships. Intimacy sets off old alarms. It is not being dramatic, it is the unconscious recognizing patterns that left deep marks, even if the person in the present cannot quite explain why they are reacting that way. I spoke about how unconscious complexes hijack our awareness. In a relationship, this shows up as overreactions, jealousy that seems irrational, sudden withdrawal. But behind it, there is almost always an inner child who still remembers exactly how much it hurt to trust and then be left behind. On the outside, this person might seem confident, sometimes even self-sufficient. They might say things like, I do not need anyone, or I am better off alone. But inside, there is a deep longing that has been buried. And every time someone gets too close, it shows up disguised as fear, irritability, control, or silence. True relationships require showing up fully. But for someone who has been through it, being fully present feels way too exposed. And then love turns into a battlefield, not a place to rest. If you love someone like this, you will need patience. And if you see yourself in this, you will need courage. Not to dive in head first, but to realize that maybe, just maybe, the present does not have to be an automatic replay of the past. Not all love hurts. Not every approach is disguised abandonment. Sometimes it is just someone trying to stay. How many times have you heard this? You are so strong, and every time you smile, say thanks, nod, but no one knows that that night you cried yourself to sleep alone again. Some people became symbols of strength because they never had another choice. When the world falls apart too early, you either hold up the roof with your own hands or you collapse with it. And so the body learns to get up every day, even when everything inside just wants to lie down and disappear. The fourth trait of those who've suffered too much is this: the persona of a strong person who breaks down alone. The appearance is balanced. The voice is firm. The gaze steady. But behind it all is an exhaustion no one sees, because showing tiredness feels like an unacceptable weakness, and showing pain not even an option. I called this persona the social mask we all wear. But when the pain is too big, that mask stops being a choice and becomes a permanent shield. The person becomes what the world needs them to be and forgets to be what they feel. The risk is that all this strength becomes a silent prison. No one asks if you need help because everyone believes you have got it all under control. But no one can handle everything all the time. No one should. What looks like stability is often just containment. What looks like self-control is actually fear of falling apart in front of someone. And then life becomes this, holding everything together on the outside while slowly cracking on the inside. And when the breakdown comes, it comes alone. In the shower, on the pillow, on the way home. No one sees. No one suspects because the performance was so flawless. It does not even seem possible that something could be wrong. But it is. It has been too heavy for too long. Real strength isn't about never falling. It is being able to say honestly, today is hard, and trusting that someone will listen without judgment, advice, or pressure. Just listen. Maybe on that day, the armor starts to loosen. The fifth trait of those who've suffered too much is sensory sensitivity. Loud sounds feel overwhelming, bright lights irritate, crowded places drain. The mind tries to stay in control, but the body reacts first. The heart races, breathing shortens. The urge to flee shows up without any clear reason. It is not being dramatic. It is not an exaggeration. It is that the nervous system has learned to live on high alert. Behind this hypersensitivity, there is a story. A childhood where danger arrived without warning. A trauma that turned the world into a threat. A body that for a long time could not relax. When emotional pain is deep and constant, the body does not forget. I said that whatever does not come to consciousness returns as fate. In the case of old pain, it comes back as physical sensations. The body speaks what the soul hasn't yet found words for. This sensitivity makes someone notice what others miss. A background sound that feels aggressive. A smell no one else picked up on. A glance that lasts half a second too long and feels like judgment. It is like living with all the senses always on, even when there is no real danger. It is exhausting and often confusing because the people around do not understand why that place felt off, why that party was too much, why that conversation left someone drained. But for the one who feels it, everything is stimulus. Everything hits at full volume. This sensitivity can be a gift when well understood. Many people with this trait are intuitive, perceptive, deeply aware. But when it is rooted in trauma, it becomes a burden. The body becomes a silent battlefield, reacting to threats the conscious mind has already forgotten, but the soul still holds. Healing begins when we acknowledge how pain impacts the body, when we understand that discomfort isn't weakness, it is memory, and that an exaggerated reaction to stimuli might just be an old scream asking to be heard. Not every discomfort is random. Sometimes it is just the body saying, "It was too much for me once, and I am just trying to protect you." The sixth trait of those who've suffered too much is the obsessive need for control. And it is not because the person is bossy, rigid, or controlling in the usual sense. It is because at some point in life, chaos was overwhelming. And they learned that if they do not control everything, everything falls apart. Control becomes a way to breathe, planning every step, anticipating every outcome, triple checking everything. It is not about power, it is about fear. fear of being caught off guard again, fear of reliving something that already costs too much. On the outside, it looks like efficiency, organization, responsibility, but inside, it is constant tension. There is no rest because even when everything is fine, the mind is still racing. What if something goes wrong? What if I am forgetting something? What if, I said, the ego tries to control exactly what the unconscious doesn't want to face. And in this case, control becomes a barricade against life's unpredictability, against the feeling of helplessness that once took over and never fully left. People stuck in this control mode struggle to relax. They hate delegating. They fight to accept the unexpected because to them, surprises are not just inconvenient. They are emotional threats. They disrupt more than routines. They shake the psyche. Often, they do not even realize how trapped they are in this mechanism. They just feel constantly tired, always overloaded, always fixing everything, always fixing even when no one asked. And this comes at a cost. Relationships become tense, small decisions feel huge. The present is never enough because the mind is always 2 steps ahead, trying to predict. At the core, this obsession with control is not a sign of strength. It is the mark of a soul that once felt completely powerless against pain and is now trying to make up for it. But life, that wild, mysterious force, cannot be controlled. It can only be lived. And living requires trust. Not blind trust, but a small possible openness. The trust that maybe, just maybe, not everything needs to be controlled to work out. Healing does not come from dropping control all at once. It comes from realizing little by a little that it is possible to exist without being afraid everything will collapse. Letting go of control is like turning off the lights in a room where you used to sleep with everything on because you were scared of the dark. At first, it is unsettling. Then it might become rest. But rest does not always come with noise, people, or conversation. Sometimes real relief arrives when everything quiets down, when the outside world stops demanding, pressing, touching. That is the 7th trait of those who've suffered too much. Silence as a refuge. It is not isolation out of disdain. It is a need for space, for pause, for time to hear your own breath without being invaded by expectations. Silence becomes shelter, a safe place, a kind of cocoon where the soul tries to reorganize itself. And that can be hard to understand for those who live outward. Those who need noise, movement, and constant company might find it strange when someone prefers a quiet corner, a shorter chat, a lighter presence. But for those who have weathered internal storms, silence is not emptiness, it is repair. I recognized the symbolic value of retreat. I saw withdrawal as a psychic process of death and rebirth. When everything feels like too much, the soul pulls back like someone shielding a wound from touch, not out of coldness, but for survival. And silence is not just the absence of sound, it is the absence of judgment, of demands, of masks. It is a space where nothing needs to be explained, where pain can simply exist without an audience, without pressure to heal fast. But over time, that silence, which started as healing, can become a wall. What was once a pause becomes a pattern, and the risk is that silence starts to mean solitude, and solitude forgetfulness. That is why this trait requires care. Not everyone who goes quiet is okay. Sometimes they are just too tired to keep trying to fit into a world that never stops talking. The path is allowing that silence without guilt, without needing to explain, but also knowing when to crack the door open, to let someone in, someone who will listen, who will stay. Because silence can be home, but it also needs a door. Now, have you ever realized how saying, I trust you, can seem simple, but for someone who was hurt while trusting, those words feel heavy. The gesture gets stuck in the throat. The emotion locks up the entire body, not because the feeling is not there, but because the risk feels too big. The eighth trait of those who've suffered too much is a heart that is overly guarded, locked, actually protected with everything it has got, and not out of malice, pride, or indifference, but because the last time it was open, it hurt, and it hurt deeply. The ego learns to protect itself. It builds invisible filters. It evaluates everything before it believes. It doubts before it surrenders. It analyzes gestures, tone of voice, even the delay between one message and the next. Love arrives, but it goes through a brutal screening before being accepted. And it is exhausting for the one who feels and for the one trying to love them, because affection never flows easily. There is always hidden weight, tension. Hey, can I really trust this? The soul lives like someone sleeping with one eye open. I spoke of the difference between living from fear and living from trust. And here, fear became the lens. The person sees everything through the memory of pain. And even when everything is fine, something inside says, be ready. This could change. It is as if the unconscious does not know time has passed. It still reacts as if the threat were there. Even when it is not, even when this time the other person is kind, present, gentle, distrust becomes a way to avoid pain, but it ends up blocking the real experience of love, because there is no deep connection without some form of surrender, without risk, without opening the door for someone to come in. And the most ironic part, the ones who guard their hearts the most, are usually the ones who long to love and be loved the deepest. They just do not want to feel it all over again. They just want to protect themselves. But overprotecting also hurts. The key might be in testing slowly, trusting a little, seeing what happens, taking a step, not opening everything, but also not running away. Because maybe, just maybe, this time love did not come to hurt. It came to stay. The ninth trait of those who've suffered too much, a sense of justice, sharpened by pain. It does not come from books or grand speeches. It comes from first-hand experience with injustice, with betrayal, with being silenced, with the helplessness of being deeply hurt, and no one stepping in to protect you. A soul that has been crushed by injustice learns to smell it from far away and will not tolerate it anymore. The slightest spark of disrespect sets off an old alarm. And even when everything seems fine, the reaction comes strong as defense, but also as memory. I understood that. Emotional complexes activate when the present touches the same wound the past created. And this sense of justice is one of those wounds, a trait of someone who carries the scar of being silenced and now refuses to stay quiet. Sometimes people around someone like this do not get it. They think it is overreacting, being dramatic, impulsive, but it is not. It is the psyche saying, not this time. This time I will not swallow it. This ethical sensitivity often shows up early. Kids who saw wrong things and could not do anything. Teenagers who rebelled against absurd rules. Adults who defend causes with the intensity of someone trying to save their inner child. The archetype activated here is the moral warrior, the one who fights for coherence, for respect, for integrity, not for perfection, but for dignity. And this fight, when balanced, is noble. But when guided only by pain, it can turn into rigidity or intolerance. The challenge then is this: to keep that sense of justice without letting it become armor against the world. To use the sword, but also know when to lower it, when to listen, when to embrace. Because those who have been hurt by injustice know exactly how it wounds. And for that very reason, they have the rare chance to do things differently, to be the kind of presence that protects without punishing, that fights without getting lost in the war. Those who carry the sword of justice know something many do not. Pain sharpens perception, and not just to spot injustice, but also to notice what no one else sees. Because those who have suffered too much develop a radar for other people's pain, even when it is disguised as silence. There are looks that cut through, not because of what they say, but because of what they quietly perceive. People who know when someone is not okay, even when they smile, who feel what hasn't been said, who understand what no one ever shared, and who hold space without asking too many questions. That is the 10th trait of those who have suffered too much, the ability to see the invisible in others. It is as if pain tuned their senses. The soul becomes more alert, more empathetic, more open to sensing where the sadness hides, even when it is masked. And this is not magic, it is memory. Memory of having lived in the very skin what now can only be detected in tiny signs. This kind of perception is not taught, it is born. Or better yet, it is awakened after a fall. Those who have cried quietly know how to listen to silence. Those who felt alone in a crowd learn to recognize when someone else is in that same place. It is almost instinctive. I said that as we integrate our own pain, we become more able to recognize collective pain. That is exactly what this trait is, a kind of emotional radar that does not seek to be noticed, but shows up when needed. And often it makes all the difference. This sensitivity may seem gentle, but it carries weight, because seeing what no one else sees is also a responsibility. And those who feel too much for others often forget about themselves. They absorb, they care, they get involved, and they disappear. The key is balance, to see others without losing yourself. to be present without dissolving, to feel with someone but not carry everything alone. This ability to perceive the invisible is a gift, but it is also a reminder. Pain, when processed with awareness, becomes a tool, a presence, a touch that does not invade but supports. And even when the world keeps rushing, those with this trait know the truth is in the details, in how someone sits, in the pause between words, in an I am fine that does not quite convince, and only someone who has felt real pain knows what that truly means. But seeing others so clearly comes at a cost.